Hi, everyone. This is Mr. Garcia, and today we're going to be starting Unit 5, which is all about World War One. Hopefully, a lot of the information you're going to find here in this presentation here today is going to be a refresher of something you might have learned last year in world history, as a lot of the stories today come from world history, but it's important to understand the state of the world before the United States really got involved in it. The Unit 5 study about World War One is going to kind of take a look at what happened, first of all, how the United States reacted, and what the aftermath was on behalf of American society. How did things change for people here as a result of World War One? So let's get started. You see the maps, and you've probably seen these maps before about the way Europe looked before the war, and how Europe looked after the war. A lot of new countries are born in the midst of the two major empires, the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that collapsed as a result of their losses in World War One. And a lot of people gained their freedom as a result. But we're going to kind of go back and talk about how it began. And it comes back to a story back in 1914 with a guy named Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir to the throne, the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, this country right here, this empire right here. He's next in line to become king, but he gets killed. He gets shot in the stomach. His pregnant wife, Sophie, is also shot and killed by a guy named Gavrilo Princip. Gavrilo Princip, who was just a teenager from considered to be a Bosnian terrorist. But he was from actually the country right next to Bosnia called Serbia. And the way the story goes, in making a long story very short, is that this little section of land that's colored in purple here that you see with my mouse cursor, that was called Bosnia. And Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is that country, had already been taken over by Austria-Hungary. And Gavrilo Princip, being from the next door neighbor Serbia, wanted Bosnia to be liberated. These countries down here in southeastern Europe are Slavic countries, meaning they have their ties to the east, where Russia is. Russia is probably the biggest Slavic country in the entire world. So the Austro-Hungarians, now that they need somebody to blame for the death of their future king, they can't blame Bosnia because they've already conquered Bosnia. Well, we're going to declare war on you, Bosnia. Well, you already have conquered them, so what are you going to do? They can, however, look at where Gavrilo Princip was from and look at Serbia. So they make a lot of demands against the Serbs. They started putting heavy pressure on them. And that made Russia very upset because, hey, the Russians and the Serbs, they're Slavic people. They got to stick together. So in the course of late June into July of 1914, all these things are taking place. All these conflicts are building. The Austro-Hungarians are putting pressure on Serbia. They're building up their army here again on the border to potentially go in and invade Serbia. The Russians don't like it. So the Russians send their army to the border of Austria-Hungary to say, hey, don't threaten my friends because we got an army too, and we're going to come to their defense. Well, that's a problem because the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans are friends. So the Germans see the Russian army right on their border, and they're saying, wait a minute, we don't want your army right here. So all it takes in that little situation here is kind of like a push, one little push, and something called militarism, which we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. But ultimately, what happened in the course of this story is that the Austro-Hungarians declare war on Serbia, the Germans declare war on Serbia, the Russians declare war on Austria-Hungary, then they declare war on Germany because they are linked together in an alliance. The Germans declare war on Russia. The French come in because the French and the Russians have a treaty together. They have an alliance together to say if Russia gets attacked, then France is going to be on their side. So the Germans declared war on France. The French declared war on Germany. The Germans tried to invade France, but the French army put up a pretty strong fight. So instead of fighting in northeastern France, they invaded Belgium, which is flat, and they went in through the northern part of France there. Well, the problem with Belgium is that the United Kingdom was best friends with Belgium. So the UK declares war on Germany for having invaded their neutral friend Belgium. The Germans then declare war on the United Kingdom, and all of Europe has spiraled into war. And all of that happened in the span of 1 week. 1 week. The Austro-Hungarians declare war on Serbia. The Russians declare war on Austria-Hungary. The Germans declare war on Russia. The Russians declare war on Germany. The Germans declare war on France. The French declare war on the Germans. The Germans invade Belgium, which makes England mad. The British declare war on the Germans. The Germans declare war on the British. All of it spirals into chaos in just the span of 1 week of late July 1914. All it took was one bullet to kill the future king of Austria-Hungary, and the entire continent of Europe spirals off into war. So the reasons behind that we have to look at with some great depth because it's kind of crazy. This is something that you probably would have learned last year called mania, the causes of World War One. So let's look at it again in the event that you don't remember this from world history. The M relates to militarism, meaning that you glorify how powerful you are, how strong your armies are. You want to have your armies always prepared to go to war. If you're always on preparation mode, if you're always in boasting mode, and look how big and bad we are, all it takes in that little situation is a spark, and then everything goes crazy. That spark came in the form of a bullet that killed the future king of Austria-Hungary. The first A here is alliances. As I just mentioned, the French and the Russians had an alliance. The Germans and the Austro-Hungarians had an alliance. When you have alliances in that situation, you're going to band together, because if you're going to get in a fight, you'll be a lot more happy if you have your friends that say, hey, we're going to be on your side. Hey, we're going to fight with you just in case you go and get into a fight. That's what happened here. Problem is that everybody has their armies ready to go. Everybody's linked up in alliances. And if you're in an alliance, you can't back out of it. And that's how it worked with alliances. The N for nationalism. And I guess you also see who the alliances were here. Eventually, the United States would come in on the side of the Allied powers, but we'll talk about that in a later slide here. The N is nationalism, the idea of feeling pride in your country. When you think that my country is the best country in the world, and we're wonderful, and we're faultless, and we do the best things for everybody, and we have extreme loyalty to our country, that's great. But when you start saying my country's better than yours and you're inferior to us, then you start seeing a problem. That's how this kind of spirals out of control here, not only in World War One, but it also happens again for World War Two. The I, imperialism. All these countries that you see here, at this point in time, we're taking over other countries in Asia and in Africa to take their goods, to help their industries grow, to make more money for them. So in the idea of rivalry over raw materials, over goods, over places to sell your products, that's going to be a big, big cause of what happens here in why these countries attack each other, trying to kind of push them out of the land that they controlled, so then they could have access to the markets for selling their goods or for taking the goods that are found in those countries. And the final A is what we just talked about a second ago, which is the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. And with that death of the one man that caused this entire thing to spiral out of control, you look at the 5 causes for what we reference as mania, which is an easy to remember acronym related to the causes of World War One in Europe. What are we doing? What's happening in the United States? We're watching this all happen. Notice I haven't mentioned anything about America yet, but what's happening here? We're watching this from afar. We have a president, Woodrow Wilson. He's saying, do we get involved? Do we not get involved? Do we somehow make money off of everybody? What are we doing here? The United States official policy is neutrality. We want to stay neutral. We don't pick sides here. We don't want to get involved in a war. We're not going to get involved in the affairs of what's happening in Europe. We do that partially because we were selling stuff to both sides, goods, items, whatever else that they kind of needed and they wanted to buy from us, we sold to them. So we're kind of playing both sides because we're making money on it. And if that's the case, the U.S. says, all right, we're neutral. We're making money. We're not being attacked. So our people aren't dying. So it seems to be okay with us. That's the idea of what's happening. The internal strife, which we'll learn about a little bit later on in this unit, what's happening to the people in America is really hard because of so many people are immigrants. So many people are from Europe that are living in New York and Philadelphia and Washington and Boston. And yet they have these ties to these countries because that's where they're from. So then they start feeling like, ooh, I live down the street from a German guy, but I'm a Serb, or I'm a Russian, and I don't really want to talk to someone who's from Austria. You start to see the way it causes turmoil within the United States and our population. This is how it all starts to fall apart, and how we were kind of forced in many ways, at least some will argue it was still nonsense that we were forced to do this, but in many ways we were forced to join the war. There are several things you want to understand, and again, you might remember this from last year. First, the German submarines were called U-boats, and they were the ones who pretty much blockade Europe. The problem with ships on top of the water being blockaded by the British or by the French is that the submarines can go right underneath them and there's no problem. No one can get to them. The German submarines also have torpedoes, which can blow up ships, sink ships, kill everybody on it. This is the idea of the German U-boat, and it's the idea of unrestricted submarine warfare. Meaning, if there was a ship that was sailing across the waters of Northern Europe, and it was a British ship, well, who's to say Germany is not going to shoot a torpedo and blow it up, sink it, bring it to the bottom of the sea? There was nothing that could stop them because the Germans or the British didn't have submarines that were there that could compete with the German U-boat. One of the particular moments here that pushes us towards war was the sinking of the ship called the Lusitania. And if you remember this picture, which you might have seen last year in history, the Lusitania was a passenger ship from Britain that got torpedoed and sunk. 1,200 people are dead, including about 200 Americans. And when Americans start dying, people in America are like, wait a minute, what are you doing here? Like, why are you killing our people? We have nothing to do with this. The Germans said the Lusitania was carrying ammunition, and all these people that were on board were kind of like human shields, so to speak, to say, all right, they're not going to shoot down this ship because there's all these people on board. Wrong, wrong. Germans blow it up, kill this many people. The reason why the ship blew up the way it did is because it was carrying ammunition. So the Germans kind of called the British on their bluff, and 1,200 people had to die as a result. But now the U.S. is upset. And the U.S. steps in and says, all right, this is unacceptable. And the Germans, not wanting to anger the U.S. and start getting the Americans involved in this war, said, all right, we'll sign the Sussex Pledge, which ended the blockade of Germany, ended the blockade here in the northern European area of Britain, to say, all right, we're going to stop shooting the passenger ships. We're going to stop shooting merchant ships. We'll let the blockade up. People can travel freely. That was kind of their compromise made to make sure the U.S. did not join the war as a result of the Lusitania's bombing. And you think, all right, everything's fine and dandy, but then it falls apart even more. It falls apart because of this. The Germans stopped that idea of the Sussex Pledge. They stopped their adherence to this idea that we're going to stop shooting passenger ships. And they started once again blowing up anybody in any ships that came that direction, no matter who it was. American ships got blown up, British ships got blown up, French ships got blown up. And the American people are like, well, that's unacceptable. What are we going to do? Is that enough to go to war in Europe? If one of our ships gets blown up and some stuff, cargo gets sunk to the bottom of the sea, is that enough for an entire country to go to war? The answer to that was probably not. But the third and final step here to add to unrestricted submarine warfare, to add to the Lusitania, and then finally, which is called the Zimmerman Note or the Zimmerman Telegram. And this was a message that was going from the German Foreign Secretary, which is the equivalent of like the United States Secretary of State, the #1 diplomat for your country. Arthur Zimmerman, the German Foreign Secretary, sent a message to Mexico and said to Mexico, hey, if you help us in this war and you declare war on our enemies in Europe and you're siding with us, then we will help you take back land from the United States that you lost in the Mexican-American War, roughly 60 years prior to this, which included, as you see in this picture, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California. They said, hey, Mexico, if you help us, we'll help you get your land back, because that used to be Mexico. Then the U.S. took it when they beat you in that war. So we're going to help you get it back. And at that point, Woodrow Wilson has no choice but to finally say, all right, we have now been directly threatened. They have said to Mexico, we are going to help you invade America and take back the land. This note, by the way, was intercepted by the British and then turned over to the United States. We have now been threatened. So now we go to war. And ultimately, the United States declares war soon after that, which was a moment that a lot of people in the 1920s will argue wasn't worth it because of the loss of life that was soon to take place. It wasn't worth it. They really said, hey, you really thought Mexico was going to invade Texas and take back Texas? That's the reason why you sent 100,000 men to die in Europe for a conflict that didn't involve us, that didn't threaten us? Why? That's how people will argue in the 20s. And our next unit of Unit 6, remember that fact, because it comes back into play when people started to rebel against their adult parents in the 1920s. So now the U.S. is at war. The question is, how do you get people on board? How do you get people energized about a war like this? That for some people are saying, in Europe, where is Europe? I can't even identify. Where Austria, Hungary, never heard of it. What do you mean we're going to go fight over there? How do you get people on your side? And that comes down to propaganda. The way I would define propaganda, as I do it every year in my classes, is I would say propaganda is one-sided information that's used to persuade. One-sided information used to persuade. You're looking at a picture, you're listening to a speech, you're watching a film, and it's geared towards making you believe something. And in this case, the propaganda used in the United States is used to get people to believe just how big, awful, and bad the Germans were, the Austro-Hungarians are, so that we can unify as a country and say, all right, we're going to put all of our help and our resources into fighting against those horrible brutes, as you see here in this picture. Enlist in the U.S. Army. When you start looking at other ones of how we're going to stab this monster and we're going to win in this halo of somebody being holy, that's the idea of propaganda. Join the U.S. Marines, chase away the German Dachshunds and the pointed helmets that was so characteristic of German soldiers in World War I, with a little spike on their helmet. The idea of propaganda is big. We see propaganda every single day of our lives when we look at how people are using information to get us to believe something. That's how propaganda works. We're going to do a little propaganda project. You're going to watch a little video about this here momentarily. But that's the idea of how the United States comes on board. Later on in this unit, we'll talk multiple times about how the American public joins the side of the war, how we start financing the war, how we start getting our soldiers ready for the war. But all the study for this first lesson of World War I was about talking once again about how it started. Why did it start? What were the factors that led to its beginning? So with that said, that'll do it for our lesson here today.